Hey everyone, this is Piers. Okay, so I wanted to record a quick walkthrough of how I created this animation that you can see here, hopefully to make it easy to follow and make it easy for you to take these ideas and like riff on them and make your own stuff. So I'll just scrub the timeline backwards and forwards slowly so that we can have a bit of a look at what's going on before we jump in. So basically we have an animation that follows a path, and as the animation plays, there are some shapes that you can see appearing on top of that path. So the semicircles here and triangles and X's and things like that. And then the whole thing also has a kind of like sort of lo-fi printed DIY Riso graphic type feel. And so we're going to look at how all of those different elements were achieved and how they kind of come together to create this finished result. So I've broken out a bunch of different steps one by one, and we'll just do a quick overview here of like what's being added at each step. And then we'll actually create our own copy underneath and walk through recreating each step one at a time. So to begin with, we've just got a basic path, nothing fancy, just a line. Then using some Figma Motion settings, I applied a basic path trim animation to that path so that it animates in this perfect loop. Then I duplicated that and created a second copy, which has a different thickness and color applied to it so that we have like two nested paths. Then I animated the stroke color so that it's gradually changing color as we move from one frame to the next. Then I started adding some shaders, and this is where those shapes start coming in. So we'll look at like how that's achieved in detail. I added a second copy of that, which gives us these additional shapes at a slightly larger size. So I'll look at that as well. Then this is where that kind of lo-fi printed look comes in. I did this Riso Pro shader effect. So we'll walk through what that does. And then finally, there's some blur applied, which gives us this nice kind of soft divoted edge. And so again, we'll like look at how that was achieved and what that contributed to the overall finished result. Okay, let's jump in. So just underneath each of these, I'm going to walk through recreating the whole thing. So I'm going to start by just making a frame. And let's jump back into regular design mode for a second. I was in motion mode then. Just going to create a frame. And you don't need to watch me draw a path, so I'll just take that original path and copy it and paste it into our frame. Okay. Next, I'm going to duplicate that frame. And it's tweaking me, that doesn't line up, so let's just fix that. And let's add that path animation. So I'm going to go into motion mode. And with the path selected, if I go over to the properties panel, you can see that in motion mode, we have these two new properties, path trim start and path trim end. And it's these that we're going to use to make that path trim animation. So at the first frame of my timeline, I'm going to create a keyframe for each of those. So I've keyframed the 0 value for start and the 100% value for end. And I'm actually going to adjust the 100% value down, just dragging it all the way down to maybe like 15. So now I'm only showing 15% of my path. Okay. And what I want to do is basically move that 15% along the line. So the way I can do that is if I go to the end of my animation, we basically want to move that 15% all the way through. So it goes from starting at 0, ending at 15, to starting at 100 and ending at 115. So we've moved the 15 all the way along the line until we've actually kind of wrapped past the end of the line back to the start again. Hope that makes sense. So if I drag the 0 all the way up to 100, actually, let's just type it. And if I type 115 at the end, and it's going to look very similar to how it looked before. But now if I scrub through the timeline, you can see that segment is moving along the line. And if you keep your eye on the path trim settings over here, they're basically like shuffling along the line until they end up right at the other end. Okay, so that's how that's achieved. Now, by default, the easing will be set to this ease in out curve. So if I start this, you'll see it kind of starts slow and then it gets fast in the middle, and then it slows down again. what I actually want is like a continuous seamless loop. So I'm going to change the easing to linear. And now you can see we're just kind of looping continuously and it's never speeding up or slowing down. And one other small change I'm going to make is I'm just going to adjust the end of my timeline to maybe 3.5 seconds and make the animation longer by dragging it so that now it's just running a little bit more slowly, which will just make the whole thing a bit easier to look at. All right, next I'm going to duplicate that frame, and I want to create this second copy that has a thicker red line. So I'm going to select my path, press Command D, select the copy of the path that's underneath, and expand the width and change the color to red. Maybe let's make the width a little bit fatter. Cool, okay, nice. Now the next step was to animate the color. So I'm going to, again, just hold Option drag to create a duplicate of my frame. And then what we want to do is just jump in and keyframe the color of that path that's in the back. So I'm going to select the back path. Then on the stroke color, currently it's set to red. What I'm going to do is just hit the keyframe button to add a keyframe to the color. So you can see now we have a keyframe track in the timeline, sorry, a color track in the timeline with a keyframe on it. And I'll just move the playhead to a couple of different points. Doesn't really matter where exactly. And just change the stroke color. So I'm going to click on stroke color, go to custom, and just choose a couple of different colors. So maybe we'll go like blue here. Slightly further on, we'll go to pink. Then let's choose maybe a kind of orange. And then we'll go back to red again. And actually, to make sure that I've created a perfect loop, I can copy that first keyframe that was red and just paste it at the end. Maybe I'll just even out the spacing a little bit. And now if I go back to the beginning of the timeline and just press play, you can see that the color is being keyframed, and actually you can watch the color picker kind of dance around as the timeline is playing, which is quite good fun. Okay, so now we've got basically exactly what was going on in this frame, where the color is being animated as the path trim animation plays. Nice. So now let's duplicate that frame again, and we're going to add that shape's mosaic effect. And just to explain a bit about what that effect does before we jump in. So down here, let me just clean this up, because I had recorded a previous version of this tutorial. Okay, so down here, I have created it's kind of an explainer just to demonstrate what this effect does. So the effect is called Shapes Mosaic. I prompted this effect. Maybe it took me like, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 prompts to get this working really nicely. And I'll do a separate tutorial about how I prompt for things like this. But the prompts were something along the lines of, create me an effect which displays a different shape and a different color depending on the brightness of the content of the frame that the effect is applied to. And hopefully that'll become a bit clearer how that works in a moment. So I'll open the settings for this effect, and I'll just toggle it off quickly so that you can see what's inside the frame that this is applied to. So this is literally just a frame with a circle inside with a blur on. And so we're getting gray values in the middle and then white values towards the edge of the frame. And what happens when I turn the effect on is that in the dark values, I get a certain shape, so the square in this case. And then as we progress from dark values to lighter values, I get different shapes and different colors. And the colors are coming from this gradient that I can supply here. So if I change, for example, this first color to, let's go to green, then that's changing the color of the squares there. And if I change this color, that's going to change the color of the elements further out. And because it's a gradient, it's changing sort of several colors at once. And the shapes are basically hard-coded into the shader. So it knows to go from square through plus sign through triangle and circle and diagonal line and so on. And so if I grab the content of the frame and just change the size of it, you can see we're kind of like rippling the colors and the shapes through the frame. So yeah, really nice effect. Very easy to kind of get this kind of digital feeling, creative result. And we can do things like changing the size of the tiles, changing the spacing between the tiles, changing the amount of rounding that's applied to make them really square or really rounded. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to take that effect and I'm just going to paste it onto here. So I'm pasting it onto my frame. And now you can see I've got all of those shapes being generated on top of my input line. And if I hit play, you'll see the shapes are basically going to kind of move with the line. All right. Now, there's a bit too much going on here. I don't want all of the blue squares on top of everywhere on the line. I just want kind of a few different shapes to add a bit of decoration. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the color of those blue squares and just fade out the transparency. So just dial that all the way down to 0. And that'll just get rid of those and just leave some of the other ones. So if I hit play now, you'll see we've got some shapes, but not others, which is really kind of interesting. And as the color changes, remember we did the color changing animation over here. That's changing the kind of brightness as well of those pixels where that color is. And so that means that we're getting different shapes responding to that brightness. And so we're getting this really interesting shape animation that matches what's going on inside the frame as the line moves around. Okay, next we added a second copy of the effect at a slightly different size just to kind of layer up some more interesting detail. So I'm going to duplicate our frame again, and I'll just copy the shape effect and paste it. And let's move it to somewhere where we can see a bit more detail, maybe like here. And I'll just click on that second copy, and I'm going to just change the grid size so that we've got a larger copy. So now we've got 2 layers of shapes. If I turn off this one, we just get that single layer. If I turn off this one, we just get the large layer. Nice. All right. And then I think one other thing that I did was just change the blend mode to maybe something like hard light, or I can't remember, color burn, something like that, just to change the way that the shape is blended with the input, which is just, your kind of regular blend mode stuff, but applied on the shader. All right, what else do we do? Maybe let's just dial things in a little bit. I probably want that a little bit bigger, make it a bit more obvious. And was it maybe, I can't remember what I used, but this looks fine. So let's just go with that. Okay. Next, we added that Riso effect. So let's duplicate this. And before we add that effect, I will just jump in and explain what's going on there. So here I've got a frame with the Riso effect applied to it. So I'll turn that off quickly. And inside the frame, I've just got some shapes and a blur applied on top, a regular Figma layer blur. So with the Riso effect turned on, we get this kind of nice, really DIY kind of printer look. And so this is a shader that basically recreates the look of Riso printing. So like this lo-fi studio printing effect. Really nice look. You get this a lot in art prints. So this shader basically kind of recreates that sort of appearance. And just to explain a bit about how Riso printing works. So basically when you do a Riso print, there are separate screens for each color, and then you have a fixed set of inks, so a particular red, a particular blue, and so on. And it's a bit like screen printing. They're like layered on top of each other, and you can deliberately offset them, like misalign them, in order to get this nice misregistration kind of layered effect. And so this shader attempts to recreate that type of look. So if I turn off all of these colors, and then maybe just turn on one at a time, you'll see, so what the Riso shader will do is it will take the input, it will try and find the closest matching Riso shader color for each of the input colors that you've provided, and then like sort of force those pixels to be that color. So as we turn things on, we're starting to get some matching Riso colors come through for our input. And the more we turn on, the more close matches we'll get. So we get more and more detail. And we can simulate that misalignment that I talked about earlier. So if I turn that all the way down, then there's no misalignment. If I turn it all the way up, then we get this nice like splitting appearance. And also we have a few options for how we like dither at the edges. So if we change this to noise, for example, we get a really nice kind of classic noise look. We can also go to like lines. Lines is really nice. Let's just turn up the size. That gives us this scan lines kind of effect. Yeah, super nice effect. I love playing with this. So I'm going to take that effect, copy it, and just paste it on top of here. And now when we play through, you'll see we're getting that kind of offset look. We've got the sort of lo-fi graininess being applied. And so we're starting to get closer and closer to that final look that we had. And we can play with things like maybe we don't want the line dithering, maybe let's use noise. And we could try like turning some of these colors off. Cool. All right. Next, the final thing was that I added some blur. And this is where a bit of the magic comes from. And I'll just explain as well how that works before we jump in. So this is our frame before. And one thing that I didn't mention at the time, which was a bit of a cheat, is that as well as having the Riso effect on here, I also have a blur. So if I turn the Riso off, there's a blur here. That's just a regular blur. And if we put the Riso back on, what the blur is doing is it's creating some bleed and separation at the edges. So if I dial the blur down, you'll get an idea of what that does. That's where the lines are coming from, is that when the Riso printing is trying to approximate this smooth fade that we have at the edges of our colors, it's because it can't print lighter or darker shades of a certain ink because it only has a fixed set of inks and it can't mix them in the same way that a modern printer would. Instead, what it has to do is like is dither, basically, like create small gaps in order to approximate lightness and darkness. And so feeding in a blurred input means that we get that dithered appearance at the edges. And if I set this back to noise, then by maxing out the blur, that's how I can create this like really soft look. And we also get this nice warping, which is really cute. So going back to our design, if we just take a copy of this and I will wrap these in a frame selection, and then watch what happens when I jump in and apply that blur. So I'll just pick a nice segment. And then with my inner frame selected, I'm going to just add the blur in and just dial that up. And as I do that, I get all of this nice detail coming through the edges. So just to tear that down a little bit, because I know it looks a bit magical when all of these nice shapes and details start appearing. If we turn off the Riso, if we remember going back to this thing, the reason that we got all of these different shapes along the edge of the grayscale gradient there is because we had a blur applied to this circle. So if we dial the blur all the way down, let's just type 0, then we're just going to get a really hard edge with almost no shapes. And as we increase the blur, then we start getting additional shapes where we have a gradient. Because if you remember, it's about mapping the brightness of the pixels inside the frame to different shapes. And so when we go back to here, that's why when we adjust the blur here, we're getting all of those different shapes, like all the more variety introduced at the edges, which is really nice. And if we turn the Riso back on, we also get that nice noise pattern, as we just talked about. So now if we play it, we've got this really cool final effect. Now, I think this definitely needs a bit of dialing in. There's like too much going on here. I would probably go into the shapes, mosaic effects, and do things like adjusting. We've got a couple of settings here for how the brightness is processed before we decide to map it to a shape. So we can use that to sort of adjust the detail. And maybe let's also just change the grid size slightly so we get a bit fewer shapes, and increase the spacing so the shapes are a bit smaller. Something like that is looking quite nice. And then I think one final trick that I did was I also applied a bit of animation to the blur strength. So if we go back to the original, there were some points where the blurriness kind of increases. I think somewhere around here. There you go. It gets more blurry, which is just kind of a interesting pulse, and it means that the line in the middle goes kind of a bit more like a worm shape. So let's just add that in. So I'm going to go to this frame, hit play, and let's go to about the same place, and I'll click on the container that has the blur applied to it, and then let's just make some keyframes on blur. So I'm in motion mode, going to open the effect, click keyframe to store the current value. So now I've got a new blur keyframe. Then I'll go slightly further in time and just increase the blur. So now we go like really blurred. And then let's go back to like a lower value again. And then maybe later on, let's make a new keyframe and do it again. And let's go really high this time. And then again, I'll just copy and paste that keyframe to get it back to the previous value. So now we've got a bit of a pulse. Maybe let's make that a bit stronger. So I'll double click this keyframe to jump to that time and just increase that value a bit more. So now we've got this kind of pulsing effect. But you can kind of just take things and riff from here. Maybe we can throw on a lens distortion. Let's go to shader, lens distortion, and I want to apply that just to my paths. Let's make it really distorted. And now we can kind of move that path around, which is kind of cute. Yeah, all kinds of cool stuff we can do by just stacking and recombining effects. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Let me know what you'd like to see more of, and if everything was easy enough to follow. And see you next time.